Tonight's shiur is Ilui Nishmat Avi Mori Dover, Meir Ben Alevi, Mima Rati Rachabat Harav Michael, and of course this week we are continuing to talk about Avram Avinu and parshat Vayayra. And let's get this up here. Let's get what we need in terms of our source sheets up here. And one of the parts that I wanted to talk about, what I'd like to focus, the part of the parsha I'd like to focus on tonight is not the beginning of the parsha where we read about the story of Avram and the three visitors. It's not the end of the parsha where we read about the Akedah. Somewhere sandwiched between those two, we have a story recorded that seems to us to be deja vu. We just read it last week. And I wanted to focus on these two stories, the one that we read last week where Avram is traveling to Egypt with Sarai. This one where Avram travels to Gerar, or to land of the Plishtim, with Sarah. And interestingly enough, we have a very, very similar story that we're going to read in 2 weeks, not about Avram and Sarah, but about Yitzchak and Rivka. So we have these three stories that I will call, the title of tonight's shiur is She Is My Sister, Achoti Hi. And we're going to try and see if we can understand these stories, try to derive some lessons from these stories. And I'm afraid, I'm going to warn you right now, that I have read these stories numerous times. Obviously, we read them every year, and always have more questions than I have answers. And I think I leave each year with more questions than I had last year, and fewer answers than I had last year. So we're going to start with the column to, I guess it's my right, so it's your left, or whatever. I don't know if you're in the room, it's your left. If you're on your screen, I don't even know where it lands up on your screen. But we start with last week's parsha. Now, interestingly enough, last week's parsha begins, Avraham has just arrived in Eretz Yisrael after Hashem tells him, Lech Lecha. And the first thing that happens, the Torah tells us after he's traveling along, is that there's a famine. Vayira Ba'aretz. Avram decides to go to Mitzrayim. And interestingly enough, the Torah uses the phrase Lagur Sham. Avram does not go there to settle. He goes there for a temporary stay so that he can survive the famine. It specifically tells us that this famine was a very severe famine, but it was specifically Ba'aretz. It was specifically in Eretz Yisrael. Egypt has no famine going on. There's plenty of food there, it seems. So Avram decides that rather than sit in Eretz Yisrael and wait for a miracle to sustain him, he is going to take the bull by the horns and go to Egypt, where food seems to be available. Now, this is not abnormal that there should be food available in Egypt when there's none in Canaan, because Canaan, or Eretz Yisrael as we know it, is very dependent on that magic thing coming from the sky called rain. And if we don't get proper rainfall, we don't have proper crops growing. Whereas the Egypt, which is very much dependent on overflow of the Nile, there is no rain in Egypt. So it's definitely not dependent on rain for food supply, for crops growing. So it's perfectly natural that there would be a famine in Eretz Yisrael while not a famine in Egypt. We see similarly, we're going to see that same story repeat itself again. If we look in the Toldot story on the other side of the page, again, Vayira Ba'aretz. And again, we're going to see as the story develops there that Yitzchak also feels, okay, there's a Rav here in Eretz Yisrael, we got to go to Mitzrayim. We find the same thing with the third of the patriarchs, Yaakov. When he is faced with a famine, of course, he sends his sons down to Egypt. Ultimately, they find Yosef there, and the whole family ends up in Egypt. So it's not abnormal that the family would go to Egypt for the duration of the famine until we go back. The only other famine that I can think of that's recorded in Tanakh that specifically where somebody decides to leave, that's so bad that somebody has to leave Eretz Yisrael, is the beginning of the story of Ruth, the story of Ruth, where Naomi and Elimelech decide not to go to Egypt. They go the other side of the Jordan, they go to Moab. And that's a whole different story. But just for completeness, want to mention that that's another story of a famine and somebody leaving Eretz Yisrael because of a famine. So it's not abnormal that Eretz Yisrael has famines where it's not a global or even regionally wide famine. It's specifically a very localized famine, primarily because lack of rainfall. Okay, we have the same thing, as I said, with Yitzchak, when there's a famine, he's also, now it's interesting because in Yitzchak's time, it says, Milvad ha'ra'av harishon. In addition, or over and above the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, there was another famine in the days of Yitzchak. So again, it seems we could take from that, these were the only two famines for this entire period of the patriarchs. So only these two famines that were that severe that they had to leave Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Interestingly enough, the middle story, the one we have this week, there's no famine. It just says, Vayisa misham Avram artzo Negev. Avram is traveling to the Negev. He had been living up until this point, apparently living in Chevron. It seems that's where the story of the visit of the visitors came. Apparently happened during while his living in Chevron. And Avram decides it's time to move on. Now, Rashi quotes here that the reason Avram decides to travel away to the south is because he wanted to distance himself from the destruction of Sodom. Perhaps as a result of the destruction of Sodom, the land either was less fertile, or if we think about Avram's proclivity for needing visitors to visit him, perhaps because of the destruction of Sodom, fewer people were taking the trade routes through Hebron. Avram wants to set up shop in a new location. And what does he decide to do? He decides to dwell between Kadesh and Shur in a place called Gerar. Gerar, again, south central Eretz Yisrael. And we're going to see that it's not necessarily what we might think of as Eretz Canaan. It's already the land of the Plishtim, and we're going to see that as we go through the story. Interesting enough, we have the same concept that Yitzchak, when he goes during the famine, he goes to Avimelech, the king of the Plishtim, also to Gerar, this same location where Avram goes, not during a famine, but Avram goes, as I said, perhaps to avoid what has happened in Sodom or distance himself from there. At least that's Rashi's perspective. Now, it's very interesting because when Yitzchak travels, the Torah then gives us a whole long story how Hashem appears to Yitzchak as he's leaving Eretz Canaan, and he says, Al Tered Mitzrayim. Okay, Avram, when there was a famine, went to Mitzrayim. You, Yitzchak, don't go to Mitzrayim. Shchom Baratz Asher Amar Alecha, you got to stay here, which is Gur Baratz Hazot. And Hashem promises him, gives him all these blessings of Avram. Again, the same, very similar to what Hashem told Avraham, both before and after he traveled to Egypt, as we talked about last week, in terms of promising him that his descendants will inherit Eretz Yisrael. He'll have lots of descendants. Why are Yitzchak's descendants going to be blessed? Because Avram listened to my voice. Because of Avram's connection to me, you, Yitzchak, his son, are going to be blessed. You're going to get Eretz Yisrael, lots of descendants. And so Yitzchak says, okay, God says, I got to stay here. I got to stay here. The Parshanut, why Avram is able to go to Egypt and Yitzchak isn't, Midrashim want to tell us that Yitzchak, because of his level of being set aside to be an offering at the Akedah, was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael, and he is the only one of the patriarchs who lives his entire life in Eretz Yisrael. Interesting enough, sidelight, if we look at the three patriarchs, we find all three types of Jews throughout history. We find those that are born in Eretz Yisrael and have to leave for whatever. We find those that are born in Eretz Yisrael and are able to spend their whole life there. We find those that are born outside of Eretz Yisrael and ultimately end up in Eretz Yisrael. So those are the three role models that we have. Our three avot represent basically any type of Jew when it terms of living in Eretz Yisrael. All of them live part of their lives in Eretz Yisrael, and only one, Yitzchak, spends his whole life in Eretz Yisrael and never leaves. Okay, having said that, we then get to the next step of the story. Okay, interestingly enough, the Torah tells us. Let's go again to the first column to start. In the story where Abraham is traveling to Egypt because of the famine, before they even get to Egypt, I suddenly realize how beautiful you are. The Egyptians are going to see you, and what are they going to do? They're going to kill me, so that you'll be alive. They're going to kill me, so you'll be a single woman, and somebody's going to end up taking you into their harem. So if you'll say you're my sister, in other words, that I will be able to survive, not be killed, and not be in a dangerous situation, because as your brother, I'm less likely to be killed than as your husband. We today, living in the 20th, 21st century, find that passage a very, very strange passage in terms of Avram seems to be putting Sarah at risk to save his own neck. And if we think about, or if we understand, perhaps if we've studied ancient cultures and ancient societies in terms of the not necessarily the danger to the husband, but certainly the danger to the wife, or at least not necessarily danger, the probability that she was going to be forced to compromise her what's the word I'm trying to think of, her relationship with her husband by being forced into a relationship with the local tribal leader is not trivial. Throughout history, there are many cultures where it was perfectly acceptable and expected that as somebody who came and was under the shelter of a local, I won't call him monarch, we'll call him a local tribal chieftain, had to, as part of that deal, allow his wife, or allow this tribal chieftain at least one shot at his wife, if not more, depending on how well the chieftain liked his wife after time one. And this is not abnormal. And so it seems even stranger that Avram would here again be risking Sarah, but perhaps by being his sister as opposed to his wife, he is at less risk and she is at less risk. So that's why Avram takes that course of action. Obviously, we all know the end of the story is that it backfires slightly, but if we look at this week's story, Avram no longer consults Sarah. He just says, "Vayomer Avram el Sarah yishtalachoti." When Avram was asked about who Sarah was, he just said, "She's my sister." He doesn't tell her that she should say she's his sister. He just says she's my sister. Doesn't say what he discussed it with her or not. Perhaps it was understood that he was going to do that from the previous time, but one would have thought, and this is one of the underlying questions of this whole story, one would have thought that Avram might have learned something from the first episode, that doesn't matter what he says, she's going to get taken and she's going to be in trouble. So again, Avram seems to be putting Sarah at risk of being abused, being sexually abused or sexually assaulted or whatever, in exchange for his life. So we have to wonder what type of trade-off that is. And that's a very, very large question. I don't have any good answers to this question. So that's one of those questions that isn't going to answer. Interestingly enough, despite perhaps, again, whether Yitzchak knew either of these stories, because both of these Avram stories happened before Yitzchak is born, I don't know that this is the kind of story that Avram and Sarah would have shared with Yitzchak during his formative years. But clearly, Yitzchak either understood or realized that he's in the same predicament. So when Yitzchak is in the similar predicament, when people are asking about Rivka, who she is, Vayomer Achoti, he gives the same exact answer. He says, she's my sister. He was afraid to say, she's my wife, because the people will kill him so that they're rid of him in order to take Rivka. And as I said, this was not abnormal that people would kill a husband so that they could take a beautiful woman as their wife. Whether the wife wanted it or not, she really didn't have a whole lot of choice, unless she wanted to basically commit suicide or, run where. Okay, so she was basically at the mercy of anybody who came and took her. We also have to remember society then very different. Society, certainly in terms of the role of women vis-a-vis their husbands, vis-a-vis, as I said, the local tribal chieftain, king, governor, whatever you want to call them, in terms of vulnerability. So again, both Avram and Yitzchak feel that they are at risk if they are married to this beautiful woman. It's interesting, as I said, the story repeats itself again. The Torah goes through the story, as I said, twice with Avram in two different locales, once with Yitzchak. And it seems to be telling us, again, unless we are to take the opinion of those Parshim who say that, well, this was all incorrect, the Torah is telling us that, and the Torah is showing us by the consequences of what happened, the incorrectness of this. Other Parshim say, no, the Torah is trying to tell us that when your life is at risk, you have to take every possible natural precaution that you can, even if it means compromising somebody else's safety, mental safety, but not their life. Again, so there seems to be, as I said, question as to what is the lesson that we're supposed to be learning from this parsha. Okay. In each case, we find, in first two cases, of both the case of Avram, we find something that is expected, that Avram was afraid would happen, happens. By Hikva Avram Mitzrayim, when he gets to Egypt, in the first case, the women, they see her beauty. The officers of Paro see her, and they praise her to Paro. Now, interestingly, that is passive. She is forcibly taken to the house of Paro. Whereas in the case of Avimelech, it says, Vayishlach Avimelech Melech Gerar. Avimelech, the king of Gerar, sends for her. Vayikach etzar, and takes her. Now, presumably, Vayikach means he takes her. It doesn't say that he takes her forcibly. Maybe it was forcibly. We don't really know. We don't get. It's not the same thing as Vatukach. She was forcibly taken, or seemingly taken by force, as opposed to Vayikach could mean that he took her with her permission. We don't know. Perhaps she consented to go because she figured once she's there, she will explain the story to him, what's really going on. Don't know. Now, interestingly enough, the protagonist in both the second Avram story and the third Avram story is known as Avimelech. Either one case Melech Plishtim and the other is called Melech Gerar. And the question the Parshim ask, is it the same Avimelech or is it two different Avimelechs? Avimelech is the Plishtim, Philistine equivalent of Paro, that the ruler is always called Avimelech. So is this the same Avimelech in both stories? And if we look at his response, that perhaps we might say, gee, he learned his lesson the first time. He went through this once, he wasn't going to go through it again, because in the story with Sarah, he immediately takes her. Whereas in the case of Yitzchak and Rivka, it says, he waits a little bit, they're there a little while. One day he's looking, or maybe it says he is looking through the window. Yitzchak is doing something that obviously shows Avimelech that she's his wife, not his sister. Whether they were holding hands, whether they were doing something more than that, don't know. But clearly, in the culture they were in, they were doing something that was reserved for man and wife. Avimelech sees this and realizes that he's made a good decision in not immediately reaching out and taking Rivka. Or perhaps he realizes. Okay? So again, we see different results, different things happening, but two of these seem very similar. As I said, the one with Avram, both seem to be going in the same direction. Now we get to the where the stories diverge. The first two, okay? Oh, okay. One thing. Okay. Interestingly enough, in the story in the Egypt, it says Avram Heitiv We're told that in Egypt, Avraham is, because of Sarah being taken to Paro, he gets all sorts of gifts. And perhaps the Parshanim want to suggest, specifically told Yitzchak, I saw this, and wants to suggest that there's a vast difference between Avimelech, who wants to take Sarah immediately, and Paro, who is really, it says, if we read with Paro, it says that she's taken to Beit Paro. She's taken to Paro's house, which could mean, and interestingly enough, it's the Sarei Paro who see her. The Sarei Paro are praising her to Paro, and she's taken to Beit Paro. She's not taken to Paro. She's taken to Beit Paro. Again, it doesn't say who took her. Well, it could be the officers are taking her, and if we think about it, and again, one of the comparisons that the Parshanim are trying to fall back on is the whole, what I will call the whole beauty pageant that Achashverosh goes through, where you didn't go to see the king, you didn't go suddenly show up one day on the king's palace. That night you were with the king. You had a whole year's waiting period. And if we look, at least the Parshanim want to say that each of the different women in Achashverosh story are presented. Each of the king's officers are vying who's going to present each one. Each one has to be presented to the king. It's not she just shows up on the king's doorstep. Some officer of the king is responsible for presenting her to the king under royal protocol. So perhaps Sarah had only reached the officer's house, and they were all, vying over who. Well, they figured she's such a beautiful woman. They were all, fighting each other for who was going to have the privilege of presenting her to the king, and that's what's happened so far. And therefore, they are all vying for that privilege, and they're also giving Abraham gifts so that he should consent to their being the one to present. Perhaps that's just a thought. Okay. Interestingly enough, in the Avimelech story, there's no story about Avram, anything happening with Avram as a result. It's just that she was taken to his household. Interestingly enough, the Torah has a whole story later on in the Yitzchak story, telling us about all of the blessings Hashem sent him, how he becomes very wealthy. Has nothing to do with Rivka, because we find in there Rivka wasn't taken. But it's interesting that, as in a comparison to Avram's story, where Avram suddenly has this wealth as a result of during the famine, he's achieved all this wealth. We find similarly that Yitzchak, even though it's the middle of a famine, Hashem blesses him exceedingly, and he achieves great wealth. And the Torah goes through a whole bunch of psukim to describe this whole wealth that Yitzchak achieves, and how ultimately Vayikanu Oto Plishtim, the locals get jealous. He's so rich. Okay, so that which ultimately plays into the story there, but just some food for thought. Okay, now we get to, as I say, where the stories diverge. In the case of Paro, as soon as the Torah tells us she's taken to Beit Paro, it tells us Vayinaga Hashem et Paro negayim gidalim v'et beito al dvar sarai eshet Avram. As soon as she's taken to Beit Paro, Hashem immediately sends a plague, significant plagues, to Paro and his household because of Sarah. And so we see that Hashem has responded immediately to Sarah's plight, to Sarah being not where she's supposed to be, but he does it in a very, very radical way by seemingly punishing Paro for his actions, which again seems to us very radical, given that Paro assumed she said she's my brother, he's my brother. He said she's my sister. He was not planning on taking a married woman. So it seems very strange that we have this plaguing Paro's house. In Avimelech's case, interestingly enough, there is a way we'll see later on that Hashem does send some physical ailment to Avimelech and his household, but it says instead, Hashem appears to Avimelech in a dream, Vayomer lo, when he tells him, you are going to die over the woman that you've taken, the Hebrew Latbal. She's a married woman. You think she's single? She's not. I'm telling you right now, she's not. And you're going to die if you do anything, if you go any further. Now, the Torah specifically tells us, Avimelech had not brought her in that close yet. He hadn't approached her as man and wife sexually. She hadn't, not yet. Vayomer, and he says, Hashem, wait a minute. What do you want from me? Hello, she said, he told me she's my sister. She told me he's her brother. I did this with, I've got clean hands. I don't have blood on my hands. I didn't do anything wrong. What do you want from me, God? So it seems a very legitimate argument, and it seems that Hashem's response is certainly less than it was in Paro's case, and very different. The Torah doesn't say that in Paro's case, he goes to Paro and says, Paro, she's married, let her go. So it seems that there's some reason why Paro is punished immediately, and in the case of Avimelech, he's not. Parshanim want to say, well, Paro was the head of a wicked king of a wicked empire that was all, they were both idolatrous per se, but Egypt was known as a place of immorality, whereas Philistia, land of the Plishtim, wasn't as steeped in immorality, perhaps, as Egypt was. Perhaps that's what the Parshanim want to suggest, why Hashem immediately punishes Paro before anything happens, whereas in Avimelech's case, he comes and talks to him because he feels that will be the appropriate, will yield the appropriate results, whereas in Paro's case, talking to him won't do any good. At least that's one school of thought. Okay. So Hashem answers, by the way, in the dream, Hashem answers him. In the same dream, Hashem answers Avimelech. I know that you did not do this because you thought you were taking a married woman. And that is why I am coming to you now to keep you from sinning. That's why I made sure that you had this dream before anything happened. So, but Hashem then gives him instructions. Now, you have to return her to her husband. Why? Because her husband is a prophet. And he knows that even though you would have, had you had the opportunity, you didn't. And when he will pray for you, you will live. But if you insist on keeping Sarah here, be aware that you will die, and you and your entire kingdom will be wiped out. So it's very interesting the way Hashem relates to Avimelech as opposed to the way he related to Paro. Paro, as I said, it was through action. With Avimelech, it's through words. But he gives him, it's a rather harsh and direct set of rules. It's basically, quote, puts the fear of God in him, if you will. I mean, that's clearly what he's doing here. Saying, this is it. You either will do this or else. And yet it seems to us, as I said, looking at it from our perspective, that, wait a minute, Avimelech, was, as he himself says, I'm innocent. I didn't do anything wrong. What do you want from me, God? And he theoretically has a very strong argument here. Yet nonetheless, Hashem, because he wants to make sure that Avimelech is not taking this lightly, really reads in the Riot Act and really takes this to a very strong level. Okay. So again, now we go to what is the further response? Now, how does what's the response in each of these cases? Avimelech wakes up having had this dream. He calls all of his servants together. He relates the whole dream to them. And they are all rather terrified from this dream. Okay, so again, one of the things that we see, and we're going to see many times throughout the Torah and the Nevi'im, that dreams are taken very seriously. If we go through all of the different types of dreams that we are exposed to in the book of Bereshit, we see that not just the dreamer takes the dream seriously, not the person who has the dream, but anybody who he relates the dream to seems to take the seriousness of this dream. I mean, it is a pretty straightforward, serious dream. I can imagine that, if you had a dream where God was talking to you and says, hey, you're going to die if you don't do something, you'd be pretty shocked awake in the morning, and you would relate it to anybody you could to make sure that you followed through with what had to be done. And that's exactly what Avimelech does. Now, in each of these cases, we find, remember, case one, Paro's just been smitten with plagues. Case two, Avimelech has just had this dream. And case three, Avimelech has just had this revelation because he looked out the window and saw what Yitzchak and Rivka were doing. So in each of these cases, we have Vayikra, Paro le'Avram, or Avimelech le'Avram, or Avimelech calls Yitzchak, Vayomer, and the king now is going to offer a protest to the husband. Paro's case is Mazona Sitali. What did you do to me? Why did you not tell me that she's your wife? Why did you insist on saying she's my sister? I want to take her to be my wife. Now Paro's response is, here's your wife, go, leave. Not only does he tell him to leave, he makes sure he has an armed escort to escort him out. He sends him, his wife, and everybody, all of his household, his possessions. He doesn't take any prisoners, but he says, you're not staying. Go immediately, and make sure he has an armed escort to make sure he gets to the border. Okay. Avimelech's response is a little bit different. He says, interestingly enough, he doesn't even mention this, the ruse. He says, he says to Avram, what did I do to you, and how did I sin to you? Because you've caused me and my whole kingdom this great sin. Now, Paro doesn't mention any sin. He just says, why did you do this to me? Why didn't you tell me she was his wife, your wife? In other words, Paro doesn't admit he did anything wrong, because he did. Again, Avimelech immediately says, you've brought upon me this great chet. Your behavior was inappropriate, Avimelech. So things, deeds that are not done, you've done to me. So it seems that Avimelech is pleading that Avram, you might have thought that we're like Egypt, where you come in as a married as a couple, we're going to kill you and take your wife, or we're not going to kill you and we're going to take your wife. That's not my country. My country doesn't operate that way. That's what he seems to be saying, that you have the wrong impression of my country. Whereas Paro doesn't make any qualms that that's what he would have done, what he intended to do. It's interesting. He immediately sends him out, perhaps because having been punished once by God, he doesn't want to risk it again. So we see that Paro's response is just get him out of here. It's a problem. I don't want to deal with it. Get away. Get out. Whereas Avimelech says, no, I want to confront this problem. I want to understand why. What did you do? What is it about my country that you misunderstood? And he expects Avram to answer, by the way. How do we know he expects Avram to answer? Because the next verse begins with Vayomer again. It shouldn't. Why did it say Vayomer Avimelech? He should have just continued, right? And not only that, he's going to basically say the same thing again. So Avimelech then asks Avram, what is it that you saw in my country that caused you to do this? Okay, so again, he was expecting Avram to answer the first time. Avram didn't answer. He says Vayomer again. There's obviously a pause between these two verses where he's waiting for Avram to answer why he did it. He doesn't answer, so he asks him again, what is it you saw that caused you to do this? And now Avram offers an answer. She didn't answer Paro because Paro didn't give him a chance to answer. Paro said, here's your wife, get out of here. I don't want to have this. Your audience is over. Leave. Finished. Avimelech wants to hear what Avram has to say. Avram. So Avram says, why did I do what I did? Ki amarti rak in yirat Elohim b'makom hazeh baraguni al dvar ishti. I said that perhaps, they may profess to be a law-abiding society, but if there's no yirat Elohim, if there's no fear of God, awe of God, if there's no God in this country, then they'll kill me. Then it's easy. If there's no God, then it's the law of the land. The stronger one kills the weaker one, and that's it. And by the way, Avram then says, the Gamamna Choti Bat Avihi. By the way, she does happen to be my sister. We come from the same father, Achlo Bati, a different mother, Batili Lisha. She became my wife. By the way, the Parshanim say that she wasn't really his sister. She was really his niece. And that her father, Haran, at least that's what the Midrashim want to say, that Sarah's father was Haran, Avram's brother, so she's his niece, and Avram were born from two different mothers. Now, Terach had more than one wife. Haran is one mother, Avram has another mother, and they base it on this pasuk where Avram says, she is my sister through my father, and if we have the same father, or she's, even though my father is really her grandfather, but we have two different mothers. And she became my wife. I married her. And it happened as has happened to me in the life. That God told me I had to leave my father's house. And I said, this is the kindness that you should do with me. Wherever we come, just say you're my sister and I'm your brother. And so Avram basically justifies this by saying it is true. It's not a falsehood. It's not a total lie. Yes, she's also my wife. But you didn't ask that. Once I said she's my sister, you didn't ask for the whole story. She's my sister who I married, or my niece, basically. But because we know, and this is only one of the many places in the Torah where a person who is one generation removed is also called by the same name as the person in the above generation that they're removed from. So we have many cases where a nephew is called a brother, or a grandson is called a son throughout the Torah, and in many places. This is not the only place. So this is not an exception where Avram says, "Oh well, my niece is really my sister," because we have the same thing where he calls Lot his brother, even though he's really his nephew. And we have other cases in the Torah where the same phenomenon repeats itself. So Avram says, basically, if we go back to what Avram started with, if there's no Yirat Elokim, then everything goes, anything goes. And so it seems as though Avimelech, by protesting both to God and to Abraham, is saying, no, there is Yirat Elokim in this place. Yes, we do recognize a God, we do acknowledge a God, and perhaps that's the lesson that Avram has to learn from this whole story, that, hey, yes, you believe in God, but there are other places that maybe they don't believe in God the same way you do, but they believe in, let's say that they believe in that there is a higher authority that they are answered to, and therefore it's not just the law of the jungle. So perhaps that's a lesson that Avram has to learn, and that's why the Torah records this dialogue with Avimelech. Okay, Avimelech. Now, at the end of all this, Avimelech, remember, Hashem told him, Avimelech, return him and ask him to daven for you. He gives him a big gift, and he returns Sarah, and he's very magnanimous here. He says, the whole land is here. I'm not throwing you out. Paro threw him out. Here, you can stay here. Everything will be fine. You can pick anywhere you want to live. You are under royal protection. I gave all these gifts to your brother. It should cover you for anything, any problems I caused. And for all the problems I caused you, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do it. He obviously accepts the responsibility for the misunderstanding here, even though he wasn't the cause of the misunderstanding. He wants to make sure that that Sarah bears him no ill will. Vayipalel, and of course the story ends. Vayipalel Avram Elohim, Vayipolim et Avimelech et Ishtov Yam Hotav Vayeledu. Avram davens to Hashem, and Hashem heals Avimelech and his wife and his entire household. Ki otzar atzar Hashem ad kol rechem veit Avimelech. Hashem had basically stopped up the natural processes of the birth for all of the household of Avimelech. As long as Sarah was in Avimelech's household, Avimelech's women, all the women in his household were in great pain, and therefore, and as well as the men, according to one opinion, also. And after Avram's tefillah, they are all healed. So we see the Torah wants to tell us that Avram also doesn't hold a grudge against Avimelech. Avimelech doesn't hold a grudge against Sarah, and so the story seems to end at least positively for all concerned. Again, there's still this perhaps ill will toward the whole situation having to happen. Interestingly enough, as I said, in Yitzchak's case, we find that Avimelech does not throw him out right away, but Yitzchak gets strong, and ultimately what happens, they all get jealous of his wealth, and what happens there? Ultimately, similar to the Paro story, Paro throws him out. Ultimately, Avimelech tells Yitzchak, "You got to leave." Why? Because everybody's getting jealous of your wealth. People are saying you're so wealthy you can buy and sell the king. Can't have that. Not good. Not a good situation to be in. And Yitzchak leaves, and then we have the whole story there of all the wells and ultimately. But I wanted to. All this is very interesting because it's not the last of Avimelech. We haven't heard the last of Avimelech in either the Avram story or the Yitzchak story. We have a sequel to it in our parsha. That again, the Torah after this story. By the way, the Torah then continues with the birth of Yitzchak, the story of Yishmael getting thrown out, and then it returns to another story, which I'm going to go to here, which we have a few more minutes left. Right here, we go to another Avimelech story. At the time, sometime a little later on, after, again, it appears that this is after Yishmael and Hagar are thrown out. Avimelech and Fichol, his chief of staff, come to Avram and say, God is with you in all that you do, and therefore we'd like to make a covenant with you. I want you to take an oath in the name of God. If you will be false with me or my children or my grandchildren. Just like the kindness I did for you by letting you stay here, I want you to do with me, and with this land. So he's basically asking Avram to enter into a mutual agreement that they will not go to war against each other for a number of generations. Avram says, okay, I'll swear, fine. But now that they're entering into a covenant, the Torah then goes off on a sidetrack. It says, while they're making this covenant, Avram says, wait a minute, I got a gripe with you. Your servants stole a well of mine. Now, again, we have to understand we're in southern Eretz Israel, desert, lots of problems with water. Wells are a very important possession. You dig a well, you have the rights to that water. It's very important. And Avram and Avimelech, Avram says to Avimelech, I'd like to, get this straightened out. If you want to make a deal with me, you want me to have a mutual pact with you, let's get this straightened out. I don't know who was responsible for this. You haven't told me. First time I'm hearing this, Avram. Why didn't you raise it before? Probably because Avram was here and Avimelech was there. They never the twain met until Avimelech specifically comes and seeks out Avraham to make this pact. Avram takes some cattle, sheep, and gives them as a gift to Avimelech, and they have this covenant. Interestingly enough, Avram takes 7 of the sheep and leaves them as a separate flock. And Avimelech says to Avram, what are these 7 sheep supposed to represent? You were taking these 7 sheep from me, that you will be a witness. It's my well. You've agreed. It's my well, and I'm giving you this gift, so you'll see these. You'll always remember that this is my well. And interestingly enough, they call the place the well of Sheva. Why? Because they both swore that they would have a covenant for a number of generations. Interestingly enough, I would have thought they called it Be'er Sheva because there were 7 flocks, either 7 flocks of sheep or 7 sheep, whichever way we look at the pasuk. But it's because they swore there. They have this covenant that they create Beersheba, and Avimelech and Fichol go back to the land of Plishtim, and Avram lives in Plishtim for many days. Okay, basically, according to one opinion, he lives there basically until Sarah dies, or until a number of years before Sarah dies, when they go back to live in Hebron. So we see again this the Avimelech seems to want to have a very positive relationship with Avraham. He wants to seek him out as an equal. People make a brit. If you have a covenant, a treaty, a pact, it's equals. It's not somebody creating a covenant because with somebody who's lesser than them, or perhaps because he's acknowledging that Avram is greater than him in a way that Avram can harm him, and that's why he wants to have this covenant with Avraham. And also we see one of the interesting things is this guy Fichol, who is his Artzvah, is his right-hand man, also seems to be very involved in this whole negotiation, this whole process. We go back to the Yitzchak story with the same story, and it's very, again, interestingly enough, after they've thrown Yitzchak out, okay, remember I just said before that Yitzchak got so powerful they threw him out. But then the Torah tells again, after they've thrown him out of Gerar, Avimelech comes back and comes and seeks out an audience with Yitzchak. Here he brings a group of his colleagues, friends, whatever, probably an entourage. And again, who comes? Fichol Sartzva'al. Now again, is this the same Fichol? Is Fichol the general, is that the Plishtim word for chief of staff? Don't know. Great questions. As I said, I got more questions than answers tonight. But that's one, again, that the Parshanim reckon with. Is this the same Avimelech and the same Fichol? Is it a different Avimelech and a different Fichol? Is it a different Avimelech and the same Fichol? Great questions. No answers. Perhaps one day, get to Shemaim, we'll find the answers. Perhaps they're not even relevant. But anyway, so what happens here, Madua Yitzchak? Remember, they threw Yitzchak out, and then they come out to seek Yitzchak. Yitzchak says to him, what are you coming here? Avram didn't ask that. Remember, Avram was perfectly happy to enter a covenant because they left Avram alone. The whole time Avram was living there, nobody bothered him. He was under the protection of the king. It seems that in Yitzchak's time, the king felt he was no longer powerful enough to be able to protect Yitzchak. That's why he asked him to leave, because the people were all getting jealous of Yitzchak. He felt he could no longer control his people. So after that, Avimelech realized, hey, I made a mistake. I should have, at least when I asked him to leave, I should have, made a covenant with him, something with him to let him know I'm not kicking him out because I'm angry at him, perhaps. So Yitzchak asks, why did you come? What are you coming for? And they say, we've seen that God is with you. And we just said, let's have a covenant. Let's either create a covenant or perhaps renew the covenant that I had with your father, or that my father had with your father, or my predecessor had with your father. And let's see what happens. Now, see, this is why you should make a covenant with us, because we didn't do anything wrong with you. We just threw you out, but we threw you out peacefully. Okay, so this is just an interesting way that the rest of the world relates to the Jewish people. We didn't kill you. We didn't rob you of everything. We let you go in peace with all your possessions. That's a great kindness on our behalf. Okay, so a very interesting perspective that we see from that little story. It says, Vayasla Mishteh. So Yitzchak says, okay, you're here. You want to make peace? Fine. Here's a little food. Vayochlu Vayishtu. They made a party. Vayashkimu Baboka. They got up in the morning. Vayishavu Ish Leachiv. They took oath to eat to his friend. Vayishalchem Yitzchak. Yitzchak sends them. Vayelchu Meito B'Shalom, and they leave peacefully. And then, again, sequel to the story. Yitzchak's servants come and tell them they dug another well and they found a live one. They called the well Shiv'ah. Now they call the city Beersheba until that day. So it's interesting that when you think about Beersheba, twice we're told that something is called Beersheba for a reason. Here in Yitzchak's case, there's no 7 groups that are put aside. In Avram's case, it specifically says it's because of the oath. And the part one, I forgot who it was, how I saw it, says that in reality, you have to understand that it's not just the city is Beersheba, although that the city of Beersheba gets its name from the Yitzchak story. The region of Beersheba gets its name from the Avram story. In other words, the Beersheba region gets its name from the Avram story as Beersheba. The Beersheba city gets its name from the Yitzchak story. Nice, interesting origin of the name of Beersheba. Someday you might need it when you go to visit Beersheba, or if you're running for mayor in Beersheba, I don't know. But the Torah, interestingly enough, tells us 2 different reasons why something is called Beersheba. And ultimately, interestingly enough, in both of these cases, even though, as I said, in the case of Paro, let's go to all 3 of these. In the case of Paro throws him out, and we never have any more interactions between Avram and Paro. That's it. Whereas in both the case of Avimelech with Avram and Sarah, and Avimelech with Avram and Yitzchak and Rivka, Avimelech seems to want to conclude in peace with both of them. It's a sign of Hashem's blessing them that we see already, the brachot that Hashem has blessed Avram, that you will be recognized already is starting to become to fruition. That this local leader, maybe he wasn't the Pharaoh of Egypt, maybe he was only the leader of a small country, but nonetheless, he is recognizing Avram, and we're going to see later on in the parshat of Vayayra, similarly that the Bnei Chet, the ruling council in Hebron, also is going to have a similar recognition that Avraham is somebody special, somebody to be reckoned with, and that really, I think, is another one of the lessons that we have to derive from this. As I said, more questions than answers from these stories, but I think the overwhelming reason that the Torah wants to give all of these stories here is first and foremost to give us a real sense of how Avraham and Yitzchak and ultimately Yaakov later on when we get to his stories are perceived by the locals, and already the beginnings of the blessings that Hashem has promised Avram coming to fruition that we see already in the lives of the patriarchs, even though we haven't seen the full that they are fully going to take over possession of Israel. We're beginning to see that they are being recognized, at least as a force in the region. So thank you all, and I hope that I hope I've helped some, and I hope I've given you lots of food for thought and lots of questions to think about as you go forward. And I'll open up for any questions you might have, because I've asked a lot of them. So any questions, comments, or feedback at this point? Anybody? Okay, if everybody has no questions, then I will say have a great rest of the week. A Shabbat Shalom, and Be'ez Hashem, we'll see you again the next week. Laila Tov and Shabbat Shalom.
Laila